Mr. Martin Chungong is the guest of CRTV News. He is the Secretary General of the Interparliamentary Union. Thanks for accepting to talk to CRTV today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
We know it's a running theme within the EU in 2019, the management of refugees, returnees, as well as internally displaced persons. And that the Pan-African Parliament in its May session is also awarding quite some importance to this issue. For you, what explains the fact that Africa is home to so many refugees?
I think that, well, first of all, I must say that as an African living in Europe, it hurts me a lot. It aches my heart to see so many people fleeing the African continent and many of them dying in the process. And so it challenges us to look at what is causing that. And during this special session of the Pan-African Parliament, we have identified some of the causes of the refugee crisis, I would say the refugee crisis. Mm-hmm. These include natural disasters, they include conflict, but most importantly, I think that emphasis is being laid on governance that has to get its act together in Africa, governance that needs to be inclusive, not governance that does not leave anyone behind. Mm-hmm. We need to look at the rule of law and the kind of respect for human rights, all those things that if we could improve upon would deter refugee movements, would lead to many people not wishing to leave their own country if the living conditions were right. And it is governance that can fix that.
Earlier on in the conversations in the plenary, the issue of statelessness was brought up as one of the effects of the displacement or forced displacement of people. How important is this issue?
We have been told that there are some 80 million people in this world who basically don't exist because they are not recognized by any state, which means that they're not entitled to identification papers. They're not entitled, therefore, to those services that the state would normally provide. So it's a serious issue that African parliaments need to address in a very robust manner. I would imagine that on the African continent, you have a sizable proportion of stateless persons, and so we want to do something about that on the African continent. It's very serious.
In your opinion, can the Pan-African Parliament do anything significant to solve these problems?
Yeah, I think that they can do much. I think that it is, as I said in my statement this morning, it is within the realm of the possible for parliamentarians because as far as I know, in most countries in Africa, parliaments have functions enshrined in the constitutional setup, making laws, providing budgetary resources, holding governments accountable for commitments. And so we are simply saying that they should use these powers. They should wield the powers that have been recognized for them. And then there are basic things that they need to do. They have to establish a good legislative framework. It is unacceptable that people, human beings, remain without an identity. Mm-hmm. Laws have to be put in place, and it is within the powers of parliaments to establish those laws. Then you also have the budgetary powers that you cannot underestimate, the budgetary powers that parliaments have. They should make sure that budgetary allocations are going to those essential services that cater to the needs of refugees. And I was very pleased to note that the African continent is known for its hospitality, its solidarity with refugees, and that it is the continent that is bearing the greatest burden of the refugee crisis. And so we should start doing something from within as a complement to what other stakeholders from outside the continent can provide as assistance.
And why is it that in Africa, countries that have refugees feel abandoned and feel like they're wasting their state budgets on these issues?
Yeah, well, there is a problem with these international instruments, is that because they are negotiated documents, you always go for the lowest common denominator. And then many of these international instruments do not have any binding force, which means that it is left to the commitment and will of each country to implement the provisions thereof. And that is what is happening in Europe. And you also have the rise in populism in Europe that is affecting management of the refugee crisis. There are many unscrupulous politicians who are using the migration, the refugee problem to stir up nationalistic sentiments in Europe. And this is playing in the hands of some political parties that use that to reap political mileage, unfortunately. So again, the ideal is to have shared responsibility for refugee management, for migration management, but it's not the case. Reality is different. But for as long as you don't have a binding document, countries will not feel really obliged to go along with the compact. And that is where parliaments come in, because they are the representatives of the people. And we talk about, I mentioned this morning, about the need for political commitment. Parliamentarians should be made aware of the fact that they represent people. And behind every refugee is a human being whose rights have to be upheld. And so if we are agreed on that, then they should be pushing their governments to do more in terms of sharing the refugee burden.
Mr. Martin Chungong is the Secretary General of the Interparliamentary Union. He was the guest of CRTV News.